When the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov declared that America's new national security strategy corresponds in many ways to our vision, we witnessed something unprecedented in the annals of the Cold War's aftermath. For the first time since the Soviet collapse, Moscow was offering fulsome praise for a fundamental strategic document from its former adversary. This wasn't diplomatic courtesy or calculated flattery. This was recognition. To understand just how extraordinary this moment is, consider the historical context. During the Cold War, Moscow portrayed the United States as a decadent capitalist empire doomed by the historical certainties of Marxism. Ronald Reagan responded by calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. Even after the Soviet collapse, Russian and American strategic documents have been studies in mutual suspicion and competing visions of world order. But recognition of what exactly? And what does it tell us about where the West has arrived after decades of what we've been told was principled foreign policy? The document that so pleased Moscow warns that Europe faces civilizational erasure. It calls for ending the perception of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. It identifies negotiating an end to the Ukraine war as a core American interest and signals Washington's desire to re-establish strategic stability with Russia. In short, it reads like a repudiation of 30 years of Western policy since the Berlin Wall fell. But the language itself deserves closer examination. Civilizational erasure is not typical diplomatic vocabulary. It's the kind of apocalyptic phrasing usually associated with cultural warriors and populist movements. When an official American strategy document adopts such terminology, it signals more than policy shifts. It suggests a fundamental reimagining of what America considers worth defending. The strategy's emphasis on Western identity and preventing demographic change echoes themes that European populist parties have been promoting for years. And this isn't coincidental. The document explicitly celebrates what it calls patriotic European parties. The very movements that established European governments routinely condemn as threats to democratic norms. This should disturb anyone who remembers what we once stood for. The fact that it apparently doesn't disturb very many people should disturb us even more. And consider the irony we're witnessing. A Republican president, elected partly on promises to confront America's enemies, has produced a strategy document that earns applause from the Kremlin. Meanwhile, European allies who spent decades as grateful supplicants to American power now find themselves described in American strategic planning as facing demographic and cultural extinction. The Polish Prime Minister felt compelled to remind Washington on social media that Europe is your closest ally, not your problem. How did we reach this point? The answer requires us to trace back through decades of what I can only describe as strategic confusion, dressed up as moral certainty. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the West faced a choice that would define the next generation. We could have chosen to build a European security architecture that included Russia, recognizing that a humiliated great power would eventually seek to reassert itself. Instead, we chose expansion, not just of NATO, but of our conception of what the Western alliance should be. We convinced ourselves that enlarging NATO eastward was not only strategically wise, but morally imperative. The intellectual framework for this expansion was seductive in its simplicity. Countries that had suffered under Soviet domination deserve protection. NATO membership would lock in democratic reforms and market economies. A larger alliance would be a stronger alliance. Russia, weakened and hopefully democratizing, would eventually see the wisdom of integration with Western institutions. This thinking ignored several inconvenient realities. First, that Russia's weakness in the 1990s was temporary, not permanent. Second, that alliance expansion would inevitably be seen in Moscow as an attempt to lock in Western advantages gained during Russia's moment of maximum vulnerability. Third, that treating a great power as a defeated enemy rather than a potential partner would eventually provoke the very confrontational behavior we claim to be preventing. Bill Clinton's 1994 strategy laid out this expansion blueprint. At the time, Russian leaders expressed what they called hopes for partnership with the West. Those hopes were methodically extinguished as one former Warsaw Pact nation after another joined an alliance explicitly created to contain Soviet power. The alliance, having lost its original purpose, needed a new mission and found it in the project of hemming in Russia. Here's what strikes me as particularly revealing about Trump's new strategy. It acknowledges what informed observers have known for years, but haven't been allowed to say. NATO expansion has not made Europe safer. It has created the conditions for the very conflicts it claimed to prevent. The document's language about preventing NATO from being seen as perpetually expanding isn't revolutionary thinking. It's elementary strategic common sense, the kind that used to be routine in foreign policy establishments that valued stability over ideology. But somewhere along the way, we replaced practical statecraft with what can only be called missionary diplomacy. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the product of what we might call the end of history delusion, the belief that Western liberal democracy represented not just one system among many, but the final form of human political organization. Under this logic, expanding Western institutions wasn't imperialism, it was progress. Those who resisted weren't defending legitimate interests. They were standing in the way of historical inevitability. Putin's rise to power on December 31st, 1999, marked the beginning of the end of this comfortable delusion. Here was a Russian leader who refused to accept his country's relegation to junior partner status in an American-led order. For over 2 decades, he has systematically challenged that order, first in Georgia, then in Crimea, finally in Ukraine itself. The Western response has been to double down. More sanctions, more weapons shipments, more military aid, more promises of eventual NATO membership for any country willing to position itself as a bulwark against Russian influence. At no point has there been serious consideration of whether this approach might be creating the very threats it claims to address. Now we have Trump's strategy document, and suddenly the Kremlin is praising American strategic thinking. What changed? The document suggests the answer, a recognition that the current trajectory isn't sustainable. Look at what the strategy actually says about Europe. It warns of civilizational erasure and suggests that European economies and militaries may not be strong enough to remain reliable allies. This isn't diplomatic courtesy toward cherished partners. It's a cold assessment that the European project as currently constituted may be failing. The document goes further, calling for American policy to prioritize resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. In other words, the United States should actively support European politicians who oppose their own government's policies. If a European leader had suggested similar interference in American domestic politics, we'd call it election meddling. This represents a fundamental shift in how Washington views the transatlantic relationship. Europe is no longer seen as a collection of sovereign allies with their own legitimate interests. It's viewed as a region requiring American guidance to avoid political and cultural self-destruction. The strategy's celebration of patriotic European parties makes this explicit. These are the movements that established European leaders routinely denounce as far-right extremists. The Trump administration has fostered links with Germany's AfD, classified by German intelligence as extreme right-wing. The strategy document essentially announces American support for political forces that European security services consider threats to democratic stability. One might ask, what happened to respecting the democratic choices of allied nations? But perhaps more revealing is what the document says about military intervention. It explicitly rejects wasting blood and treasure to curtail the influence of all the world's great and middle powers. This sounds remarkably like the spheres of influence thinking that Western leaders have spent decades condemning as outdated imperialism. The strategy's embrace of the Monroe Doctrine makes this crystal clear. That 19th century doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere an American zone of influence. Exactly the kind of thinking we've condemned when practiced by other powers. When Russia suggests similar arrangements for its periphery, we call it aggression. When America does it, we call it flexible realism. The historical parallel is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. In 1823, when President Monroe first articulated his doctrine, the United States was asserting hegemony over a region it couldn't fully control, warning European powers against interference in what it considered its natural sphere. Today's strategy document suggests a similar approach. America will dominate its hemisphere while accommodating other powers' regional ambitions elsewhere. This represents a return to 19th century great power politics, complete with spheres of influence and balance of power calculations. It's precisely the kind of system that two world wars were supposed to have discredited. Yet here we are, with an American strategy document that treats such arrangements as not only acceptable but necessary for global stability. Here's what should truly concern us. The Kremlin's satisfaction with this document suggests that Moscow believes it's winning the broader strategic competition. And why wouldn't they? The West appears to be abandoning the very principles that once made it attractive to people living under authoritarian rule. The document's warnings about European civilizational erasure echo themes that Russian state media has been promoting for years. Moscow has long argued that Western civilization is decadent and doomed, weakened by immigration, multiculturalism, and what they call gender ideology. Now we have an American strategy document that essentially agrees with this assessment. This convergence of viewpoints isn't accidental. It reflects the rise of what we might call authoritarian nationalism on both sides of the former Cold War divide. Leaders in Moscow, Budapest, and now Washington share a common diagnosis. Liberal democracy and international institutions have failed, and only strong national leadership can restore order and traditional values. The implications for Ukraine are obvious and ominous. Trump's strategy identifies ending the war as a core American interest, but ending it on whose terms? The document's suggestion that Washington should re-establish strategic stability with Russia strongly implies accepting Russian gains in exchange for broader accommodation. This would represent the effective abandonment of the principle that international borders cannot be changed by force, a principle that has underpinned European security since 1945. Once that precedent is established, which borders are safe, which smaller nations can trust that their sovereignty will be respected by larger neighbors. The question becomes even more pressing when we consider the strategy's broader implications. If America is prepared to accommodate Russian territorial gains in Europe in exchange for strategic stability, what message does this send to China regarding Taiwan? To Turkey regarding its various regional ambitions, to any middle power with historical grievances and modern capabilities? We're potentially witnessing the emergence of a new international order based not on legal principles or democratic values, but on raw power calculations and spherical accommodations between major powers. Smaller nations become chess pieces in a larger game, their sovereignty subject to great power agreements they have no voice in shaping. The European response to all this has been a mixture of denial and panic. European Commission officials continue to insist that their policies are succeeding, even as their own strategy documents acknowledge mounting crises. Meanwhile, European defence establishments scramble to develop capabilities they were assured they would never need, having relied on American protection for so long that they've forgotten how to provide for their own security. The scramble is revealing in its desperation. Germany, which spent decades reducing its military to what critics called a social club in uniform, suddenly announces plans to station missiles on its eastern border. France talks about strategic autonomy while remaining fundamentally dependent on American intelligence and logistics. Britain, having left the European Union partly to escape continental entanglements, finds itself more deeply involved in European security than at any time since the Cold War. What's particularly striking is how European leaders seem genuinely surprised by their predicament. They spent decades congratulating themselves on building a post-national order based on international law and multilateral institutions. They dismissed concerns about military capability as outdated thinking from the age of power politics. Now they discover that the world hasn't moved beyond power politics at all. They simply stopped participating in it. The tragedy is that this crisis was entirely predictable and largely avoidable. For decades, serious analysts warned that NATO expansion would eventually provoke the kind of confrontation we're now witnessing. They were dismissed as Putin apologists or naive believers in appeasement. But the real naivety lay in believing that a great power would indefinitely accept strategic encirclement without responding. The real appeasement was the West's consistent refusal to engage seriously with Russian security concerns, preferring comfortable moral posturing to difficult strategic thinking. Now we're reaping what we've sown. A generation of policies based on ideological rather than strategic considerations has produced a situation where American and Russian interests appear to be converging against European autonomy. The most disturbing aspect of this convergence is how little genuine debate it has generated in Western capitals. European leaders seem incapable of acknowledging that their policies might have contributed to the current crisis. American foreign policy establishments appear unable to conceive that their approach might be fundamentally flawed. This intellectual paralysis isn't accidental. It's the product of what we might call ideological capture, the transformation of foreign policy from a practical exercise in advancing national interests into a moral crusade for universal values. Once you've convinced yourself that your policies embody universal human aspirations, criticism becomes not just wrong but morally suspect. The result is a feedback loop of self-reinforcing assumptions. Failed policies aren't reconsidered, they're intensified. When sanctions don't change Russian behavior, the answer is more sanctions. When military aid doesn't end conflicts, the answer is more military aid. When alliance expansion creates new tensions, the answer is more alliance expansion. Instead, we get more of the same, more sanctions that strengthen Russian ties with China, more military aid that prolongs conflicts without resolving them, more expansion of Western institutions that creates new front lines for future confrontations. The Kremlin's praise for Trump's strategy should serve as a wake-up call. When your former adversaries are applauding your strategic thinking, it might be time to ask whether you're still pursuing your own interests or inadvertently serving theirs. But I suspect that wake-up call will go unheeded. The Western foreign policy establishment has become too invested in its own mythology to acknowledge fundamental errors. It's easier to blame Trump or Putin or populist extremists than to confront the possibility that decades of policy have been based on false premises. The result is a West that no longer seems to know what it stands for or where it's heading. We've traded the moral clarity that once made Western civilization genuinely attractive for the hollow rhetoric of rules-based international order, rules that somehow never apply to our own actions. Meanwhile, our adversaries have clarity of purpose that we lack. They know what they want and are willing to pay the price to achieve it. We seem to want everything and are prepared to sacrifice nothing, mistaking comfortable slogans for serious strategy. The question facing the West now is whether this trajectory can be reversed or whether we're witnessing the beginning of a broader realignment that will reshape the international system along lines we don't control and may not recognize. If Trump's strategy document represents a genuine attempt to chart a new course based on realistic assessment of Western capabilities and interests, it might yet prove valuable. But if it's merely another exercise in wishful thinking dressed up as hard-headed realism, it will join the long list of strategic documents that promise transformation while delivering more of the same. The Kremlin's satisfaction suggests they believe it's the latter. Time will tell whether they're right. Whether